Now we're going to move on to something that's not as common. We're going to move on to putting in your cam bearings. The cam bearings. When you knock the cam bearings in yourself, how do you necessarily do that? It's not common practice for people to do that unless you have the tool for it. I looked at it like I had a lot of motors to do, and I'd taken one to the machine shop to have them put cam bearings in it, and I took them TA Performance dual groove bearings. I pretty much live and die by those things. I think they're smart, and if you're doing a Buick, it's probably what you should be putting in there as well. But they wouldn't put the bearings in like the directions had asked. I had to fight with them, and I finally just said, all right, load the blocks up. I'll take them home. And I bought a cam tool, a cam bearing tool, right? So the cam bearing tool probably cost, I don't know, $180. It would have cost me about that for just one block to be done. So the tool has paid for itself many times over, but we're gonna show you how to do cam bearings. Hey, before I go any further, I think I should probably give you a rundown on what what the cam bearing tool entails. Okay, so I'm going to grab the other piece of it here, and I'll give you the rundown on how this thing works and what it looks like. And this is a Lisle 1800. You can buy them like on Amazon, or just go to the parts store and order one. It's not a big deal. There's not a lot to it, but the big things are these pieces here. These are all your collars with the with like a rubber surface that keeps the bearing from becoming damaged. I got this one loaded up on here now because that's the one I use for all the Buick bearings. They're all pretty much the same size with the exception of the 215, 300, and 340, which have tapered bearings like a Mopar, where the rear one is the smallest and then the front one is the largest. But the front one on those engines is the same size as all the other 350, 400, 430, 455 bearings. So, because the 350, 400, 430, and 455 all use the same cam bearings, and they're all the same size throughout the whole length of the engine, right? So on this 455, we're just going to be using this one sleeve here because it's essentially just one size cam bearing all the way down, right? And the good thing about that is, if you say you got your box of bearings and you open it up, and as you open it, you drop them, as long as they're not damaged, there is no real order that you can put them in. You just put them in there because they're all the same size bearing. But there's basically your tool. Like I said, they're available like Amazon or something. I don't remember where I got this one. Probably Amazon or eBay. But yeah, that's what I use. Okay, for installing your cam bearings, the very first thing I always do is TA Performance dual groove cam bearings come with an instruction sheet, right? I'm trying to hold it up there so you can see it and possibly pause and read the thing. But the first thing it says, with the block right side up, install the bearings so that the oil feed holes are at the 3 and 7 o'clock position when viewed from the front of the block. Start at the rear of the block and work forward. Well, I start at the rear of the block and work forward, and the number one cam bearing is the hardest because you technically have to take the engine off the stand and then set it down somewhere, and then you got to install the cam bearing from the back, pushing it forward. The only reason that is because on your cam bearing installation tool, this little collar right here is what centers the cam bearing as you're installing it. And it has to use another cam bearing journal to center the whole thing. So you have to do from the back, work forward, and then when you get to the number one, it's got to come off the stand. I generally set it on the ground, and then you go through all the cam bearings that you already installed, hoping not to hit one or mar them up. And the easiest way to do that is you can either tape, I tape this with masking tape, or, well, really any kind of tape will keep you from marring it with the installer handle. Or you can tape the bearings inside the block to keep you from marring them. It's however, it sits one way, half a dozen other. It's however you feel about doing it. But all right, so to do the 3 and the 7 o'clock position, as you can see, I've already got I got my plumb bob here, which is just a piece of string with a nut taped on the bottom. And I find the center of the cam and main bearing, right? So wherever your string falls, here is 12 o'clock and here is 6 o'clock. You can have them off just a little bit. It's not that critical. I mean, every machinist in the world is probably freaking out right now watching me do this, but the easy thing to do, what I do is you mark your 12 and 6 o'clock position, and then what you have to do is split the difference, and you use a carpenter square, and you do 90 degrees off of this, and you come up with the 3 o'clock. The 3 o'clock position, each one of these cam bearings is drilled. You don't necessarily have to find the 7 o'clock. So each one of these dual groove bearings, see here it would be your 3, and here would be your 7 o'clock position. It's got 2 oiling holes in it that are already drilled in the cam bearing. So if you line up number 3, your number 7 is going to be lined up. Now, if you do it like, say, like this, you're going to have one at 3 o'clock and the other one probably around 11 o'clock. Okay? I mean, it's obvious. You look through the holes. You look for the holes when you go to line it up. But essentially, if you line up number 3 o'clock hole with 3 o'clock, verify the other ones wherever it falls. It'll be around 7 o'clock. So that's how I normally set it all up. And if you're doing this at home, it's 99% preparation for this. Just like anything else, you do body work. It's not so much painting the car, it's the body work that's entailed to get the thing straight before you paint it, right? So it's 100% prep or 99% prep, 1% painting. Same thing with installing your own cam bearings. Take the time to figure out where your positioning is going to be, because you have to, what I do is I put a positioning mark all the way through every individual cam bearing journal, right? So that way, all you have to do is look for the mark on the inside of the block and line up your number 3 with number 3 and number 7 with, you'll make a mark once you get number 7 where it's figured out it's going to be, right? But do it all the way down the length of the block. And then I generally install them upside down. I put the block upside down after I have the marks already labeled. So that way I can reach in there and use the cam bearing tool without marring anything up real like bad. You don't want to touch the interior surface of this bearing, because even the slightest touch from your finger, the oil from your finger can damage the surface of the bearing, right? So you try to keep from touching it. The other things I've noticed about the TA bearings is that this is really just a bearing I think that they probably buy, and then they cut the grooves in it and the oil holes where they want, okay? But I've always seen sometimes there's a little flashing or excess material that didn't necessarily come off with the drill around the holes. Also, because they've been drilled after the fact or cut after the fact, there's always like sharp edges on here. Now, sharp edge really isn't that bad, but what I found is when you're installing the cam bearing, and if the block catches that sharp edge, it can tear it or shear the back side of the bearing, which in this case, you have a bearing that's cut down with 2 grooves in the back, right? The bearing itself that is not as strong as a regular bearing. When you catch the edge of it, it can have a tendency of cracking it along the groove, or just breaking off that piece of that groove when you knock it in. These are press fit, right? That's why you have to have a tool to install them, and you knock them in with a hammer. They're press fit. So you do have to use some force to knock them in, and you can catch that edge, and the force will shear that off, okay? The most important one of these cam bearings with the TA dual grooves is not necessarily 2 through 5, it's number 1. Okay, and the reason for that, number 1, is where all of your oil in a Buick big block is supplied to the driver's side oil guide, right? It actually goes, the oil comes in through the oil feeds passage here, up through the number one cam bearing at an angle, and it also goes to the main as well, but it then travels across this surface. So it'll go around the cam. If you notice, the cam has a groove in it, and then it'll go around to the other side. Well, when you use a dual groove bearing, you cover up those holes and you force the oil to go around through these channels in the top and the bottom. So if you misalign this, not so much is it all that bad, because it's still going to provide oil to the driver's side. But what it does is, if you look at number 3 and say we'll put them at 3 o'clock and 7 o'clock, your oil would come in here and here, okay? And your cam is riding on this surface inside. As the oil is being provided on at 3 o'clock and 7 o'clock, it creates what they call a hydraulic wedge in the bearing surface, and the cam is rotating this direction. So it's going to drag the oil up and around that bearing, okay? So you're not directly lubricating it like you were previously doing. Like if you use a standard bearing, it would directly lubricate through the hole in the back of the cam bearing to the cam bearing surface itself, and then the oil would travel to the other side. But what happens on a Buick is it's forcing oil in here, and it's driving it around, but it's exiting on the other side, which it could leave this area low on oil. All right. The other thing is the cam has a groove cut in it on the number one journal, and it provides more area, I guess you would say, for the oil to travel, but less bearing surface area for the cam to ride on. Okay. And in this case, since your oil is traveling around the outside of the bearing and then being provided at the number 3 and number 7, which is the ideal spot for it to be, it automatically creates that hydraulic wedge. The excess oil, because the oil groove is still cut in the cam, it really doesn't play a factor in this as much. I mean, it still does provide some oil, but the grooves on the back is what really channels the oil to the other side. And that's what evens out the oil pressure on a Buick, because this number one cam bearing is very important for any Buick engine. But in this case, and you can use regular cam bearings in 2 through 5, because it doesn't do that. It doesn't have the same principle as the number one. The number one oil is on this side, the oil galley is on this side, the hole is up here by your driver's side oil galley. But if you look at 2 through 5, 2 through 5 doesn't have that. It doesn't have a hole here providing oil to this galley, right? It actually just has the one hole here, and then it provides oil at your 3 and 7 o'clock when you use the dual groove, which just creates a better hydraulic wedge for the cam bearing. But the other one, since there is no escape hole on the other side, the oil is just directed into the surface around the camshaft and the bearing, and it's going to provide a hydraulic wedge there anyway. There's no place for it to escape. It'll kind of run up the sides, but not that big of a deal. So you can just use this in the number one, and it's not a bad idea. I mean, you could probably buy a set of these bearings and then stretch them out some with just buying some like Durabond bearings and put them in there. I'm just going to use this set of cam bearings, the whole entire set of dual grooves in this block, because this is for my own personal stage 1 motor, and it did take me a while to find a good 70 block that was standard bore. So that was kind of the idea. So I am going to do all the oiling mods, and I'm going to try to make it the cam lubricate as best as possible, and I use the TA dual groove bearings for them. Okay, now I've taken the time to go ahead and mark the, and I've grabbed the phone, I've got it here in my hand, but I've taken the time to mark 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, okay? And then what I did is I used my carpenter square to bisect this line, and it comes up with your 3 o'clock mark here, all right? Then I hold the bearing up to this, and I line up the 3 o'clock mark, and then wherever that falls, wherever this hole falls, which should be the 7, I mark it as 7 o'clock. Okay, now that's kind of the easy part. The hard part is when, if you look down the block through the cam tunnel, it's like a perspective, right? It all gets a little bit smaller and smaller and smaller as it goes. But that's actually a little kind of helpful because the inside circle is a little smaller than the first one, and you can kind of position your holes there or your marks fairly easy. But what I do is I look at the block face on, and then let's see if I can get the camera square here. And then what I do is I reach my hand in each individual journal after I got everything kind of lined up, and you can see I got it marked at 3 and 7 down each individual journal, right? And like I said, the number 1 cam bearing is the most important. The 2 through 5 is kind of just as important with the relation of the hydraulic wedge underneath the camshaft on the bearing. But in reality, if you get it at 301 and 701, it's not a big deal, right? It's not that critical. I have seen guys on the forums put these at 4 and 8. I'm not a big fan, but I did mark it all the way down the length of the block doing just that. And now you have positional reference information so that you can install your bearings from wherever surface wherever you want. And that way, you know, like I said, I do mine essentially with the block upside down. Okay, so I'm gonna set you back up where you go. I'm gonna flip the block over and we'll prep the number 1 cam bearing, or the number 5 cam bearing, the first one to go in, the very last. Okay, we're back and I got you installed on the side of the motor. So hopefully when I knock this cam bearing in, I don't knock you over or hit you somehow. But you can see the number 5 cam bearing here, the most rear cam bearing. And that's the one we're focusing on that we're going to install. Now you can see the alignment marks. There's one here and then there's one here. Okay, so since the engine, I got it now upside down. The one here would be the 3 o'clock, and this one over here would be the 7 o'clock cam bearing, or the oiling hole in the cam bearing. So we're gonna get you. Give me just a second, and we'll get the tool in there. We'll get everything lined up, and we'll drive it home so you can see how this works. The first thing to start off with that I like to do is you probably apply some lubrication to that bearing. Okay, so that it's not a dry surface that you're trying to install it on. And I like to use Lucas. I'm sure there's other people, STP or just plain motor oil or WD-40 or whatever they like. But I found that the Lucas stuff is pretty slick and it hangs around for a while, which is good because I don't know how long it's going to be before I finish the rest of the motor up, right? So I like to make sure that it's got lubrication for quite a while because I might let it sit for a couple of months and then, I don't know, do something else and have to turn the motor over. Okay, so the big thing is you want to make sure your holes are lined up best, right? So 7, 3, and line them up in there. Make sure both of the marks line up with your alignment markings. And that looks to be the case. All right, so you want to slide it on the tool here to make sure that you don't hit it on this metal edge because it'll mar it up. All right, and then the easy way to do this is all you do is tighten this thing. Okay, you hold the end and you tighten it, which causes the collar to flare out and grab hold of the bearing. Okay, so I'm gonna have to do that once I get the tool inside the block, but I just wanted you to see how that was done. All right, now I normally apply a little bit of Lucas to the exterior of the bearing. Okay, now I'm gonna try to tighten it down. now our bearing is tight on there. We have to find, so this would be a reference. This is number 3. This over here would be number 7. All right, so everything appears to be lined up. I got the collar slid forward and it's capturing the tool and holding it steady in the number 1 cam bearing journal. So hang on, we're going for a bumpy ride. I saw the tool bounce there a bit, so I'm gonna tighten it up some. Sometimes it works itself loose. All right, so we only gotta knock it in just a little bit more. So there's our cam bearing. It looks like I might need to go in just a smidge more. Tighten it up some more. Now I can see the area where it's actually captured in there quite well. That's how you do a cam bearing, the home block prep. So I hope you enjoyed that show. I hadn't seen many people do one of these on YouTube, and I think a lot of it is today's younger generation. They don't know you can do this stuff at home. They think you have to take it to somebody and they got special tools. Yeah, it takes a cam bearing installer, but I mean, gosh, I think I've dropped more than a couple $100 on stupid stuff, you know, at the bar on the weekend. So it's not that much money if you look at it in comparison to how much money it saves you in the long run. You do one block, it's now pretty much cut in half what would it cost you. So if you ever did more than 2 engines, you'd probably make your money back. But I hope you liked today's episode of Mr. Rodder's Neighborhood.